Good afternoon and welcome to the CondoWise Learning Series. My name is Patricia Aaliyah from Aaliyah Associates. Today in session number 15, we're talking about aging in condos, and this is part 2. You'll recall in part 1, we talked about the human aspect of aging in condos, and now we're going to talk about leading your condo into the golden years. And we're going to focus today more on the physical aspects of dealing with your condominium. Today, I'm pleased to have join me Julia White, Jonathan Wright, and Shannon Penny from our team here at Aaliyah Associates. Next slide, please. And before we go further, Shannon, I'm going to ask you for a quick update on what's going on with the pandemic.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Patricia. So good afternoon, everyone. As I'm sure you're all aware by now, the Ontario government released a plan last month to safely reopen the province that will manage COVID for the long term. The plan outlined the gradual approach to lifting the remaining public health and workplace safety measures by March 2022. The government announced, however, last week that it is halting a further easing of COVID-19 restrictions because of a rapid rise of new cases in several regions outside of the Greater Toronto area. So this means that capacity limits will remain in place for higher risk venues such as nightclubs and wedding receptions, with dancing until at least mid-December, despite the requirements for proof of vaccinations to enter those premises. The restrictions were expected to lift on November 15th, but a 44% increase in the 7-day average of new infections now requires putting those changes on hold. So as of today, over 89% of the eligible population in Ontario, aged 12 and older, have received at least one dose of the vaccine, and 86% have received their second dose. So last week, Health Canada approved the first COVID vaccine for children between the ages of 5 and 11 years old, giving the green light for Pfizer's 2-dose vaccine, meaning children across the country will be able to receive additional protection against the virus. So the vaccine dosage is 1/3 of a size that have been offered to those aged 12 and older, with the second dose being given at least 8 weeks later. So families are able to book appointments through the provincial vaccine portal, or they can phone the call centre or book through their local public health units, go to a local pharmacy or see their primary care provider. It's also been recommended by one of Canada's top health officials that Canada should offer all adults a 3rd dose of the COVID-19 vaccine early next year. So currently, Ontario has approved a 3rd dose for all of those 70 and older, healthcare workers and essential caregivers in congregate settings, as well as those who have received 2 shots of the AstraZeneca vaccine and Indigenous residents. So last week, Ontario also unveiled its winter COVID-19 testing strategy, which includes a holiday blitz, as well as providing students with take-home rapid antigen tests over the school break. So to prevent a post-holiday spike in cases, 5 rapid tests will be sent home for the holidays with every student, which is to be used twice a week during their time off and before they return to class in January. As well, the province said that it is looking to expand its testing plan as the winter and colder weather comes in and pushes people to spend more time indoors and obviously increases close contact. So from mid-December to early January, the province will be launching a mobile testing blitz with pop-up testing for asymptomatic people in higher traffic public settings. Locations have not yet been released, but they're expected to be released in the coming weeks and will most likely be near public spaces such as retail stores and holiday markets. So thank you, and I'll pass you back over to Patricia.
Thank you very much, Shannon. It sounds like we're taking a lot of steps to stop the transmission of the virus in many age groups. So for condos, I think, what will be interesting and still things to manage are our common elements, mask wearing, having our policies in place, using our facilities, such as our recreational areas. Those are still going to be relevant, obviously, because our numbers are going up. So if you need any assistance, just please reach out to us. We have lots of bulletins on our website that we can use to help you and provide you with some other answers if you have more specific questions. So now we have a poll. We wanted to understand, because all of you are I've noticed who's in the room, and it's a diversity of people, which is wonderful. But I wanted to know the condominium you're really working with, how young is your condominium as opposed to how old? So if we could launch that poll. And if you manage a variety of condos, pick one, that would be great, or average out the ages. So if we could close that poll, that would be great. Let's see what our results are. Okay, so people today, majority are over 9 years. Some are 15 to 30, and the majority are 30 plus. For myself, the condos that I work with as a director or former director, they're all in those age categories as well. So it is a concern as we age. And if we could have our next slide, please. So we're going to talk a little bit about getting older and what does that mean? You know, aging is inevitable. As facilities age, it's inevitable that operating costs go up, maintenance backlogs increase, and budgets get tighter. Condominium owners do not want to see unreasonable increases in common expenses. And for those who rent their units, the risk will be that common expenses will exceed rent levels in Ontario because we do have rent control measures. So, you know, the Golden Girls always gave us positive images of aging, and I really always loved that show because it gave me insights into aging. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what goes into aging and how to do it well to bring us into those golden years. So some interesting statistics. Shannon, you had put together some interesting statistics for us.
Yeah, thank you. So when was the first condominium registered in Ontario? So this was PCC1, which was a 37 two-story townhouse condominium, which was registered on November 30th, 1967. And the first high-rise that was registered was CCC1, which was registered on October 4th, 1969. So how many condominiums are there in Ontario? So there are approximately 900,000 condominium units, over 11,000 condominium corporations across Ontario today. And according to data from the 2016 census, around 13% of households actually live in condominiums. So it'll be interesting to see this statistic when the 2021 census is released. So regarding the last question as to the average age of condos in Ontario, we were unable to find this information. However, another way to look at the aging stats is to look at when condos were built. So as I already mentioned, the first condominium in Ontario was registered in 1967. But there has been a boom in condos being built over, I'd say, the last 10 to 15 years. As I already mentioned, the 2016 census, the new constructions being built in condominiums hit a record high of 37.8% between 2011 and 2016, up from 27.3% in the previous 5 years, and more than double the proportion observed between 1971 and 2000. So again, that'll be another interesting stat to look out for when the 2021 census is released. Another interesting statistic is what the common expenses were when the first condominium in Ontario was registered. So PCC1 charged $27. It's inevitable that the common expenses would increase with inflation. However, back in 1967, there was no need for owners to contribute to a reserve fund, whereas the Condominium Act has required since May 2001 that all condominiums have a reserve fund where a portion of the owner's monthly common expenses are deposited into the reserve fund account every month, which of course has contributed to the increase in monthly payments. The reserve fund account is separate from the condominium's operating fund, and it's used to pay for major repairs and replacements to the condominium's common elements. So thank you, and I'll pass you over to Patricia, who will discuss the lifespan of a condo.
Thanks very much, Shannon. And those are interesting statistics. It tells us a few things. And, you know, age can be relevant, and our stock is aging in Ontario, given the age of PCC1 and the CCC, I've forgotten the number, Shannon, but the multi-story that was, you know, the late 60s. So these these buildings, these physical assets are aging. And when I look at it, I always try to think about the timeline in a condo's life in condo years. So at the registration of the declaration, which is birth, we're at year 0. Youth is 0 to 9, I think, and everything looks great, right? Beautiful windows, doors, everything is pristine. And, with the help of Terion and the developer, things get restored, hopefully, to the way that they should have been delivered to us. And as a side note, Terion is a vital process that should not be ignored. Look at it as helping you build your building in its childhood. It's an early assessment of the truth of what the building is comprised of. Boards should be diligent in the Terion process, reviewing the Bulletin 19 reports for those that are over 8 stories to understand the guts of the building and how it was built. So as a child, everything is wonderful and it works and we're learning. In the youth of the condo, we're still learning, but we're bold and we may drink too much soda or partake too much fun. And perhaps taking care of our health is ignored. Rituals like repair and maintenance, similar to going to the gym, may be overlooked. Once we're in middle age, we're well into the routine of our lives. We have kids, we have responsibilities, our communities have expectations, rituals. And, we have those regular arguments. When are we going to turn on the heat on this side of the building because it's cold on the north side? It's an issue we all face as a board member every year. But in old age, what happens is our decisions of our youth start to catch up with us. Next slide, please. I found this report. It was created in January of 2018 from RDH. And if you would like the link to read it, we can definitely provide that. Every building, of course, is unique, and the need for maintenance, repairs, and asset renewal will vary depending on many factors, including quality of construction. And this is why I said sometimes age doesn't matter. I actually think that some of our newer buildings are going to age really quickly. I think window wall systems are going to create a real capital asset demand for replacement earlier than what we have thought. Design details, exposure conditions, and the standard of care given by owners will impact how a building withstands. And what you see here on this chart, I thought it was interesting because the report sort of followed what I was thinking are the prenatal stages and then original construction. You can see the core, the green, is the original routine, like the routine maintenance plan throughout all the years. And then you've got capital asset renewal. When do you replace and take out pieces of the building and just not try to band-aid them anymore? I have some clients that, that are really living with older windows, for example, that should have been replaced. And the question is, what is the impact on an asset to the overall condo's operation that has failed, really? Next slide, please. So what can we expect to go wrong when we get older? What about dealing with the mistakes of previous boards? What about what contributes to ensuring asset security? Because that's really where we're going here. We're trying to figure out, can we extend the life? What happens when life is over? What are our options? And, when we're extending life, how can we do this so that our building ages well? Before I turn it over to John to talk about legal proceedings, I just wanted to also identify some of the things that we can expect to go wrong. Building control systems will develop problems as they age. The difficult part is figuring out the reasons for those failures and how to fix them. So common problems are getting repair parts, servicing systems, integrating older systems into newer ones. You hear about security systems being the original security systems, but not meeting today's technology. How do you marry the two? Roofing, there are lots of things that could happen in roofing, but even if you neglect maintenance, you could create greater problems. Elevator systems, after 25 years, how do you get that very expensive asset up to current standards? Plumbing is something that deteriorates over time. And the question is, how do you fix it? Do you go for the pinhole leaks or do you go for the full stack replacement? Lighting, electrical use, can you go to LEDs? fire alarm systems, making sure you're in compliance with applicable laws, windows I've mentioned, and even the building facade. A building facade can actually help improve energy efficiency with some new design techniques. So John, did you want to tell us a little bit about, what we do when we're dealing with inheriting previous decisions of other boards?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we're looking at what we've titled mistakes of previous boards, what we're generally looking at are boards that have failed to follow the professional recommendations of people like engineers who have advised on certain repair and maintenance steps that need to be taken. Maybe they've taken band-aid repairs and those haven't worked and they've maybe caused more problems, or they've outright refused to deal with particular problems as they arrive. They haven't consulted with engineers. They've ignored the problem and the problems got much worse. Or, for example, they have instructed engineers to, or reserve fund planners to amend their reserve fund studies to pass on the cost under future years so that things don't have to be dealt with. So there are a number of concerns with respect to how to deal with these mistakes of previous board members. The biggest one that we're seeing currently is really the failure of boards to properly address the repair and maintenance. When those issues arise, what we were looking at in those particular instances are to really sue the previous board members. Now, the Act under Section 37 provides for the duty of care that all directors and officers will have, and that they're required to act honestly in good faith and to exercise the care, diligence, and skill that a reasonably prudent person would exercise in comparable circumstances. And that's not something that we can tie down as being a set definition. I can't tell you for each individual condo that there's one set standard. It really is fact specific. So, for example, if you have a reserve fund study and the engineer is telling you, or the planner is telling you, we can do this now. We can do a band-aid repair that is going to put out the major repair a few years to allow you to fund for it, and that is recommended or acceptable. That's maybe going to meet that standard. When you have boards that are saying to engineers, well, we're not going to do that, you're going to have to change this, or we're not going to accept this, we're just going to go and find somebody else that will agree with us and pass on the cost, that maybe doesn't meet the particular standard. You also have the sort of an indemnity on the liability of directors when they rely on, in good faith, upon reports that are written by a person's qualified to make those reports. So when we look at these mistakes and what can happen, it may not necessarily be the mistake of board members. It may be the mistakes of professionals that board members have relied on. And in that instance, we're thinking of reserve fund planners, for example, who maybe don't necessarily have a proper understanding of the common element components or the condition of them. Maybe they have relied on, and we're seeing this more and more, the previous reserve fund studies that have been produced and are simply just forecasting the costs forward instead of carrying out a proper inspection of the common elements and the components, or they have misunderstood historically through the industry how costs are to be projected for certain components. And Patricia had mentioned window wall replacement, and we're certainly seeing that in more and more cases. And on that particular component, what we have come to understand is that at a very early stage, nobody really was able to project with any degree of certainty how the window wall system could properly be repaired and replaced. And there was really just an estimate, forecast of how the individual components could be replaced or repaired. And now, after these components have been in place for a number of years, we're seeing engineers coming back and saying, well, actually, no, that cost that was projected is not close. In fact, it's in some circumstances millions of dollars out. So you're having reserve funds that are millions of dollars short, everyone looking to the board saying, what on earth has happened here? And the board saying, well, the reserve fund study actually says this, this, and this, and this is what we saved for, and these are the individual components, and this is what they cost, and this was the funding table, and this is, we've done all this. We didn't make the mistake. The good thing is that engineers are required to be insured. So we would have potentially a cause of action to sue the engineer, or the corporation would have the cause of action against the engineer to try and recover the lost costs. We're also seeing boards that have maybe not undertaken reserve fund studies in accordance with the provisions of the Act, or they have what is known in the industry as deferred financing, where there are components that have needed to be replaced and haven't been replaced, and the costs of that particular repair, instead of being done 5 or 10 years ago, is now being looked at now or being forecast in the next couple of years. And the cost to do that repair is now 40, 50, 60% higher than it would have been had the repair been done in when it was needed. So in addition to deferred financing, what would we be looking at there? Well, again, it would be looking at the board members and claims against board members potentially for breach of Section 37 and for negligence. You're required under the Act to, in most cases, for the corporation to repair the common elements. And when that's not done, that's also a breach of the Act, but it can also be negligence, and it leads to damages. And who pays for those repair costs? Well, it's every other unit owner. In addition to having the costs levied on the current unit owners, you've lost the opportunity to save for that money, those repairs from previous unit owners. So now you have maybe new unit owners that have been in the corporation or owners in the corporation for really a couple of months, and we're looking at them saying, well, I didn't know about this, and the board saying, well, neither did we. And it's, well, why do we have to pay this large amount of money? We've only been here for a certain period of time. So that can give some maybe food for thought for unit owners to look to the board for maybe the status certificate wasn't done properly, or maybe there wasn't proper investigation, and opens up a whole other can of worms. And then sort of cap this all off is Section 135 of the Act, which is the oppression remedy, which in short outlines that if a corporation was to unfairly disregard the interests of unit owners, in this case by, for example, failing to conduct repairs or maintenance, unit owners may have another cause of action against the corporation to say, well, you know, you were required to do these repairs, things have aged, things have not been taken care of as aging happened. This was to be expected. These components don't last forever. I brought this to your attention many times, perhaps, and you just haven't done anything about it. And now, despite me asking you many times, nobody's taking any steps. So, you know, you need to do something. I'm going to ask a judge to order that you do it, and I'm going to ask for some of my costs to be paid. And I'm also going to be asking for awarded damages, which can be awarded under Section 135. So really, when we build out on the mistakes of previous board members, there's the mistakes of engineers, there's ignorance, there's Section 135 issues of oppression, there's the standard of care that directors are held up to. So it's really a bit of a minefield, Patricia. I don't know if you have any additional thoughts that you have there.
Yeah, I think, you know, I think it's good to be aware of the minefield and the fact that we could step into something, especially as directors, as unit owners. I think that's also something that we need to help educate the industry on is, you know, where is your condo in the execution of its obligations? And the reserve fund study is a very powerful tool. Why? Because it lists component inventory, and that is all the capital assets that make up the common elements of the corporation. So you've got a comprehensive list. It's got a 30-year lifespan currently. You get an estimate of, you know, how long your asset will last, and then you've got a funding plan that works with it. And to me, this is where boards can contribute to ensuring asset security. Myself as a board member, I sat with the board at a multi-story for many years, about 16 years. And we did it from inception together. And what was interesting was that we were very proactive in making sure our reserve fund study was up to date, that we understood the priority systems of the building and the priorities in terms of capital asset repairs. And What we did was we planned ahead. We always made sure that our contributions were not overly generous, but very conservative in terms of estimating what the future value of the project would be. And we always made sure our increase in common expenses was modest within the standard of living for the city of Toronto, because the condo's in Toronto, but it was always about 2%. And 2% over 15 years was very beneficial to this condo, because when it got into middle age, the condo itself had enough assets at its disposal in its reserve fund to be spent. And this is one of the other key elements, is that the reserve fund is not an account for saving for a rainy day when things go wrong. That would be an incorrect interpretation of the use of that money. That money is to be used on a regular basis. I recently sat at a town hall that was hosted by MPP Chris Glover, who is going to be bringing a motion in the legislature on transparency. And one of the comments made by a participant in that town hall was, if you do not see your board spending the reserve fund money on a regular basis, that should be a warning sign. That was a very succinct but accurate statement, in my opinion. And I think that's what unit owners, boards, and management teams should actually be tracking. You know, if you're a new management team, you want to see what has been spent and where people are in their execution of their capital asset replacement. And I think that's what also goes to contributing to ensuring asset security. Next slide, please. So now what we're going to do is we're going to ask you a question about whether or not your condominium has updated major capital infrastructure such as windows, roofs, heating, and cooling systems in the last 10 years. Could we run that poll, please? Thank you. If we could close that, that would be great. Let's see our results. Excellent. So 81% have confirmed that they have been doing capital asset replacement. This is something that we all want to see, and it should be a litmus test in the industry. The interesting thing will be is, do we need to legislate this into play? And do we need to have a litmus test that's run on every condo to see where they are in execution? If we could go to the next slide, please, and close the poll. Thank you. So this is part of the analysis in my mind, is prioritization. And I'm sorry, there's a typo there. But how does a board prioritize its capital asset replacement objectives? Is aesthetic more important than structural integrity? Do the two intersect? And how can we be proactive? So I'm going to ask Julia to tell me about the value system piece and how we make that decision. But let's go to the first question. How does a board prioritize its capital asset replacement? It relies on its engineers. That's really the clear answer. And it should be from the time of inception if you're lucky enough to be part of a new board. What the performance audit report and the first reserve fund study does is it gives you an idea of the quality of what you've inherited. And I'm hoping that the engineers on this call and the people who are working with engineers are really talking to engineers about the quality of the assets that make up their building. It's better to know that your windows are not going to last you 25 years and plan for it, that it will be an expenditure in 10 years. But you need to be honest about that. And you need to be upfront with your unit owners on, look, folks, this is what's coming first. It's coming that windows will be first, the roof will be next, and then we're going to look at the other systems of the building. My personal value is around the guts of the building, first and foremost, because I would hate there to be a flood because we fail to maintain our pipes, and would mean that we would not necessarily get affordable insurance or insurance at all. And see, I think that's the other thing, is we need to help our boards connect the dots on how our maintenance and repair decisions translate into operating costs, including the access to things like insurance. So, Julia, what do you think about aesthetic versus structural integrity? Do the two intersect?
Thanks, Patricia. So I don't think you can really give a blanket response to this question. The building obviously needs to be in a good state of repair and be safe and usable for all owners and others who are using the building. And this is paramount, but there are times where aesthetic is also important. In every condo, the value systems of the people living there are different. And even within each condo, some people will be more interested in the aesthetic rather than the structural integrity. That's not to say those people don't care about the safety and structure of the building, but that aesthetic is also important to them. For example, if someone's looking to sell their unit and they would have a choice between, say, updating the exterior of the building or remodeling the lobby and then fixing a structural component, that individual might be more interested in the remodeling because it could help with the sale of their unit. The motivation or agenda of a unit owner might be very different than that of the board. Aesthetic-based motivation isn't appropriate for boards because they're responsible for ensuring that the building is safe and functional and that all components are working properly. Ultimately, it comes down to boards listening to the advice of professionals and understanding and abiding by their reserve fund studies. If a structural project could be put off for a few years based on the advice of the corporation's engineer, and in the interim, the corporation has the funds to carry out an aesthetic project, then the board could make that decision. Another thing to consider is where the board does decide to do an aesthetic-based project. This could be a good opportunity to make upgrades in accordance with new technology and construction requirements, such as installing LED lighting, which would help save the corporation money in the long term. So it's not just about consumption, but also about saving money, ensuring compliance with applicable statutes such as the building code, and then staying up to date with new technology and materials. There's also an intersection between structural and aesthetic when carrying out a structural project. So for example, there's a case we'll be discussing at the end of this session that talks about a deck replacement project, which was required, but there were different aesthetic options. In this case, it was vinyl versus wood materials, which wouldn't really change the structural outcome of the project, but would look different. And of course, one was more cost conscious than the other. So in these cases, even if owner approval isn't necessary, it might be a good idea to hold an information meeting and just to get input from the owners as to which option they would prefer, because if you're doing the project anyway, aesthetic is important to some owners and to the board. So it's a good idea to seek unit owner input, even though the decision is ultimately up to the board.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think that communication can go a long way. Knowing that the decision-making, lies with the board is important, but it's also great to make people part of part of the process. And I think even being proactive, you brought up good points about how we can save energy in design. And I think as well, with AODA compliance requirements, we also have other legal requirements now in condos to make sure that accessibility for people with disabilities, barriers are removed. So design has actually changed as well quite a bit. So, it's better to know that. I know of a board that was going to renovate their lobby, and AODA came into play. And what they did is they actually put it off to time it with the evolution of those regulations, and actually did a phenomenal job of integrating the AODA requirements into the lobby. Looks like it was always the original lobby, except modernized, and such a welcoming, wonderful space for the community. It just took a little bit longer than they had thought. But that was about being proactive. They thought ahead. They knew what their legal obligations would be, and they decided to make sure that they could meet that, because you would hate to do a project and then have new regulations or new obligations on you and have to do it again, because that would waste resources. So next slide, please. So what is the most important tool or tools to ensure the physical well-being of your condo? Well, that's not an easy answer. I think it's your board personally, and it's the knowledge of the board and your professionals working together. Understanding your component inventory, understanding the reserve fund and the reserve fund funding plan. having a repair and maintenance schedule. And, you know, some boards come to us and they say, can you create one? And we've helped them do that by looking at their documents and looking at the assets. But it is something that from inception should be there. And it is a good way to have a checklist to see if you've met your priorities. And sticking to the repair and maintenance schedule, doing good quality, reasonable work that will hold up. You know, that's always the penny wise, pound foolish, you know, approach that makes condos pay more than once. If we could have the next slide, please, and the poll. So we're curious to know, do you feel the corporation's reserve fund is keeping up with inflation and the costs of capital asset replacement? This is something that always troubles me, just because, you know, the pandemic alone has created shortages of materials, has put pressure on supply chains, which is obviously going to impact the cost of assets, and even finding labor in your wherever you're located, the city of Toronto, you know, Northern Ontario. These are all things that will impact what's in your reserve fund. So if we could close that poll, I'm just curious to know. We're almost breakneck there, but 55% do not feel that it's keeping up. And that's interesting for us to explore further with our reserve fund planners. The next slide, please. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the tragedy in Miami. Most of you know that in June of 2021, the South Tower of the Champlain Condominium, a 12-story beachfront condominium in Miami, partially collapsed. 98 lives were lost. 35 people were rescued the same day from the uncollapsed building, which was demolished 10 days later. The evidence thus far indicates that the condominium had substantial concrete structural damage to the pool deck and was overdue for repairs. And while the federal authorities have not yet concluded on the investigation, determined the cause of the collapse, a number of experts and engineers believe prolonged structural damage, delayed repairs, and environmental issues over 4 decades could have contributed to the building's deterioration. There was a structural report on October 8, 2018, by a structural engineering company to the corporation that identified numerous flaws in the building or failings in the building. Window frames and glazings were at the end of their functional lifespan, cracked tiles on the balcony, waterproofing below the deck, and the entrance was well beyond its useful life. In other words, there was a report, there were signs, and there were signs actually in this condo from the beginning, right from the time that the development occurred. And the facts are becoming much more interesting as the lawsuits are evolving. You know, everybody, of course, is being sued, and the concern is, you know, how to analyze who's responsible. What I've learned, and I'm going to have our CondoWise host or moderator, Justine, put in a link to an article by the New York Times, which takes you through actually a reconstruction of the building and how it collapsed. But you can see that the pool area, which looked so innocent, was actually intricately involved in the failure of this building. You will see in the article how the support columns were inadequate. They were spaced too far apart. What I think this is going to do, though, and this is really where I think the important information is what kind of legislative changes are we going to require? Are we going to require mandatory third-party inspections on the building's structural integrity every 30 years? In Florida, there actually is this legislation, and it was for buildings that were that were 40 years old. I think that what could have done some good here is that if there had been intervention early on, that there hadn't been a debate by the unit owners as to whether or not it was too expensive, and that a third party came in and said, you have to fix this, fix it now, and if you don't, we will, and we'll fine you. That is the kind of level of really involvement that a third-party governmental organization, in my opinion, should have had. Could I have the next slide, please? You know, I think here as well, you know, the board, I've written an article about this, and when I was doing my research, I found that the board was frustrated. The board had read the engineering reports. They knew something had to be done. Could they have had a better management team? I think so. I don't see where the management team was putting this board on notice. Now, the minutes might reveal that, but I would strongly suggest if you're part of a management team and you see things like this in engineering reports, make sure that you are covering yourself to make sure you put the board on notice. Look at your management contracts and how far you have to go as a professional in providing advice to the board. I think at a minimum, your minutes should show that you have asked the board to have an engineer review any element, and that the report is presented to the board for their consideration. Also set boundaries on unit owner input. There's a point where the buck stops with the board. You know, where unit owners push back against corporations and they say, no, it's too expensive. No, we don't need it. If life safety is weighing in the balance, life safety should win, right? And get your 3 quotes, follow industry practice, be transparent about procurement for sure. But the end goal should be rectification. Should you specially assess? Absolutely. Why would the tool exist if it wasn't viable? But today in Ontario's market, we have lenders who can help in emergencies, in unexpected circumstances where the cash need is required right away. Loans can be done within 2 weeks. I've seen that done. So, you know, the bottom line should have been in Miami, they should have just done the work, and they should have done it probably 10 years earlier when they knew. You know, I also puzzle at what the people in Surfside, the municipal representatives who kept coming in to inspect the building, what were they doing? I haven't heard that side of the argument yet, and I'm sure more will evolve as we do more research. Next slide, please. So going back to how do we manage an aging infrastructure, I think the best way to manage aging is to take good care of yourself from day one. Eat, exercise, rest, and have a great attitude. For a building, it's the same. A strong routine of maintenance and repair, not being penny wise or pound foolish, communicating with your unit owners, being on top of the fiscal responsibilities that come up as we age. Boards can not only can do that, but should be proactive in managing aging to ensure the quality of life of condo owners for decades to come. And that means that today's boards think about the future of the unit owners 20 years from now. And I think this starts with, you know, the board of the young condominium. And the challenge is, what is a board to know? This is where education can be a powerful tool. If it is applied, that's where the power comes from. And therefore developing really educated boards. I know that the CAO provides directors now with a mandatory education course. And I'm really proud of the fact that CCI, you know, raises the bar and does more in the area of depth and knowledge on certain topics that impact us, including structural issues. And practically assets do come to the end of their lifespan. And there's a point where replacement is going to be more cost effective than just doing maintenance and repair. You should work with your engineers to find that threshold. So now we're going to turn to case law, and I'm going to ask Julia to talk about the cases she referred to a little earlier.
Thanks, Patricia. You can go to the next slide, please. So the first case that we're going to talk about is Brasseur versus YCC 50. This case was an application by a unit owner for a declaration that the condo breached its duty to maintain and repair the common elements and that its actions were oppressive. So mold was found in the owner's unit, but the parties couldn't agree about the cause or source of the mold. The owner said it was the result of inadequate repair and maintenance of the common elements, and the condo said the mold was the result of the owner's lifestyle and their failure to maintain the unit. At the time of trial, the corporation had remediated the mold problem on a without prejudice basis, but the issue of who was to pay for the remediation was left to the court to determine. The court ultimately concluded that the common elements were the source of the mold and that the condo had not acted in a reasonable and timely manner to address the cause or the resulting mold problems, thereby violating their duties under Section 90 of the Act. While not reasonable, the court did not find the corporation's behavior to be oppressive. The corporation needed time to investigate the issue. It retained and hired more than one expert and various contractors. It met with the owners. And again, it ultimately remediated the mold in the unit. Things got delayed, but the corporation was not deliberately dragging its feet. And the condo wasn't the only party that delayed inspections and remediation. So the court held that the corporation's failure to maintain and repair was not abusive or oppressive, and the oppression claim was dismissed. So this case confirms the standard of reasonableness. Corporations are obligated to take reasonable steps in a timely manner to maintain and repair the common elements. And what's reasonable will ultimately depend on the circumstances of each case. In this case, the mold issue was first raised between 2009 and 2011, but wasn't actually resolved until 2018. So this was not timely enough or responsive enough on behalf of the corporation. The court advised that condos are entitled to take a graduated and cost-conscious approach to remediating a mold issue because mold issues are generally complex and reoccurring, but the issue must be dealt with without unreasonable delay. So when in doubt, it's always a good idea to seek prompt legal advice or guidance from an expert, such as an engineer, to determine what steps should be taken to address the issue. Next slide, please. So the second case is the one I alluded to earlier, Harvey versus ECC3. This is a decision from 2013 regarding a corporation's repair and maintenance obligations, which clarifies Section 97 of the Act. So this was a townhouse condo that had roof decks above the garages, which required replacement. The condo held owners' meetings to discuss the two options for replacement that were recommended by the engineer, and the corporation also held a vote on those two options. A majority of owners voted for the second option, which is what the condo ended up going with, which was the vinyl option and not the wood option. The board then levied a special assessment and proceeded with the work. The special assessment was large. It was $10,000 per unit. So the board had already determined to proceed with the project before informing and consulting with the owners. The purpose of the last meeting where the vote was held was to receive owner input as to the preferred option because both were aesthetically different. One unhappy unit owner sued the corporation for a number of alleged infractions relating to the replacement of the decks, including that the project constituted a substantial change to the common elements, requiring a 2/3 vote of the owners. And he asked the court for an order that the work be stopped and that the special assessments be reversed. The court ultimately dismissed the owner's claims and found that the project and the special assessment were within the board's power, and that the board had the right to proceed under either Section 97(1) or 97(2) of the Act. The court said that the wording of Section 97(1) contemplates a degree of latitude that was appropriate to these circumstances and the evolving construction knowledge and methods. The courts have repeatedly held that replacement of old, defective, or worn out common elements with new, improved, or upgraded material, equipment, or design still constitutes repair and maintenance, even if the result has a different, more contemporary aesthetic appearance. So the work undertaken by the corporation in this case was not a substantial change, which would have required approval from the owners, but was remedial work required to maintain and repair the common elements, and therefore fell within the ambit of Section 97(1), under which no notice to or approval from the owners was required. So the new decks were vinyl, not wood. However, even though they were different from the original construction, they were considered appropriate in light of current construction standards. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thanks. So the court set out a test to be applied to determine whether work undertaken by a condo falls within Section 97(1). The questions to be asked as they appear on this PowerPoint here. Number 1, does the area to which the work relates form part of the common element? 2, does the condo have an obligation to repair the common elements after damage or to maintain them? 3, does the work constitute repair or maintenance? And 4, will the work be carried out using materials that are reasonably close in quality to the original as is appropriate in accordance with current construction standards? So the court stated that when the answer to each of these questions is yes, the work does fall within the ambit of section 97.1, and the application of subsections 97.4 and 6 of the Act are displaced, which require unit owner approval. So this case clarifies that condos are entitled and obligated to attend to repairs and maintenance without unit owner approval, even where the proposed new features may be somewhat different from the original. That's it for me. I think we're going to move on to some questions, Patricia.
Yeah, and thanks, Julia. I think the Harvey and Elgin case is very beautifully sort of designed, that the judge actually put the test and the questions in there. So, you know, board members, even though I think you really should talk to counsel if you have doubts, because sometimes these repair projects can expand in their scope. And, you know, the engineer is giving you logical advice on, you know, doing something concurrently. For example, if you're going to be replacing the membrane in the garage, you may want to redesign the front of the building where the membrane is to redo the, you know, and add a garden. But, you know, the addition of a garden would be adding an asset that the reserve fund is not dedicated to funding. And so that's where you would need unit owner approval. And so when you speak to your engineers and your lawyers, you can ask for clarification on where does this fall in section 97. 97 is a very powerful, multifaceted section, and it is scheduled to change as well in I don't know when, but when it comes into force, it will change in terms of allowing unit owners to also provide their opinions on whether or not changes that are proposed by the board will actually impact them. So you're going to actually be now subject as a board to even the subjective opinions of unit owners to stop potentially changes to the assets. But I think, you know, Elgin is a very good starting point to know where you are. Are you in the right bailiwick or not? On the Brasseur case, Julia, I just had a question. How long was that leak going on for, or those issues? Because I thought it was the court was concerned about the time frame of how long it took.
I believe originally 2009, and it was kind of on and off. They were trying to do things, trying to fix it, and it wasn't actually remediated until 2018. So a long time.
It was a long time. And I think that was one of the things is that, you know, one of the frustrations for boards is when you have water, for example, or moisture, trying to pinpoint where it is can be a really difficult exercise, especially the managers and engineers know that water tests are not always clear or conclusive. But the board showing that it actually had taken steps was very important evidence for the court. You know, boards are still aware of the fact that condo directors are volunteers, that you know, you shouldn't take their contributions lightly and penalize them for a lack of knowledge. But at the same time, I think courts are looking to hold boards to a standard of performance that's reasonable under the Act and in accordance with their duties. Now, I don't see any questions. If you do have questions, I didn't invite any in the Q&A or in the chat. Please feel free to pop them in if you have any. John, can I ask you a question while we're waiting for the audience? Do you think it's a good idea from a litigator's perspective to communicate with owners on capital asset changes or modifications?
In some cases, if access is required through a unit, for example, it would be a requirement to give notice. Even moving further back from that, you know, we've dealt with cases where there's been town halls where engineers have come, contractors have come and discussed the replacement or the repairs and maintenance with unit owners. Gives a chance to have the unit owners ask their questions so they can understand what's going on. At the end of the day, they are paying for the repair. So in that sort of sense, it makes sense to do that. But on the other hand, there's always the sort of potential for troublemakers to come in, to create a sort of a storm. Why is this needed? Try and convince everybody it's not needed, that we're wasting money. But generally, in the balance of everything, I think it does make sense to communicate with the community and to let people know what's going on and why it's happening. It certainly can reduce the potential for litigation. If there's more informed unit owners, they're not left to their own devices, as it were, and the rumor mill won't run amok, as they say. So I think it definitely does. There is always the concern of the troublemakers.
Yeah. And I would concur. I think there's a balance to be found. And I think it's also helpful that in the record, the corporation did present an opportunity for owners to get educated and familiarized. In some of the projects that we've worked on, things like high tech, where people wanted to understand what was their responsibility, what was the corp's responsibility, why this was happening. A lot of our clients, because we went through a flurry of high tech replacements in the last few years, a lot of our clients benefited from being able to say, we did have a town hall meeting. We did put this in the newsletter. Here's the information that we put together for you. We clarified the role of unit owners. And doing that has avoided, I think, escalation of litigation and disputes, which may make John upset, but at the same time, may keep peace and harmony in the community because people are informed. I know at TSCC 1696, there was a debate on whether or not the board had the right to undertake the high-tech replacement. And it was found that the board did have the authority to do so. And it was actually managing an imminent danger, one that was unpredictable. So, I think communication it goes a long way if it's done well. And there are many ways of doing that effectively. Sometimes it's, one-sided in terms of newsletters, letters, notifications going out. Sometimes it can be interactive. And some boards have created dedicated email addresses for the board to take questions, not just on repair and maintenance or capital asset replacement, but on general questions to facilitate that communication with the community. So I'm not seeing any questions. I wanted to thank everybody that attended today. And I wish you a good day. Thank you for being with us. Please speak to your legal advisors because this is not legal advice. I also wanted to let you know that the Ministry of the Government and Consumer Services has created a consultation process on condominium insurance, something near and dear to all of us in the condominium industry, of course. So you can participate. And there's a link there that, Justine, if you wouldn't mind copying and also putting in the chat, that would be great. It's open until, I believe, January 7th, 2022 by 5 p.m. for submissions. I'm letting you know that CCI and Ontario is putting together, hopefully, a set of submissions. So if you also are a member of CCI, get your comments to your chapter so that when all the group of us are getting together to talk about what we should submit on behalf of unit owners, we've got your voice. As well, CCI is developing an exciting product tool service to its members that will be available hopefully next year to help manage insurance risk, which will hopefully impact positively the insurance premiums that we're facing, the deductibles. And we'll also have some recommendations on how to manage your constating documents to deal with these issues. Next slide, please. And just as a quick overview of what CCI has coming up, in the Toronto area, we have in the Toronto chapter, there are electronic tools to educate and boost engagement in condo communities. Golden Horseshoe has an intro to condos. Grand River, level 300 Tarion, very exciting topic. And Huronia is going to have a lunch and learn webinar in December, and that is going to be a legal panel. So again, we'll cover some of the new cases and give you some tools on how to manage the risks that are identified therein. So thank you again for your time and for being with us. Please share this with your management teams who weren't able to be with us, and we look forward to seeing you again. Take care.